Please welcome to the stage Stephen Lacey, a veteran energy journalist and producer, and the host of the popular news podcast, The Carbon Copy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm going to give you a little overview of what we're doing this afternoon before we get started. So I'm Stephen Lacey. I'm the co-founder, executive editor of Postscript Media, longtime journalist in the space, and I have been reporting on the energy transition in the last 17 years and have also been making audio around telling stories about how clean energy technologies are evolving and how they are getting adopted and what forces are at play that are holding them back. And I had the good fortune of spending 7 years hosting a podcast with these two, with Jigar Shah and Katherine Hamilton, called The Energy Gang. And when Jigar left to go to DOE and Katherine left to focus on building policy in anticipation of the IRA, we developed another series of shows, and our company builds shows in fashion, food, business, tech, and the Carbon Copy is the show that we are about to record today. And Jigar and Katherine periodically join to assess where we are in clean energy deployment. So it's a narrative news show where we feature different kinds of voices that tell stories about the nuts and bolts of how this stuff gets developed. So today, we're going to have a conversation and we're going to share some stories that are going to help us understand where the advanced nuclear industry is headed and where the rest of the industry around clean, firm power is headed. So, with that, we're going to get started. Thanks for being here. Jigar, what's the hardest thing you've ever done?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have the answer for the hardest thing I've ever done. But, I think that when you think about last year, the Secretary agreed to host the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh. And I think with 3 months' notice, she said, hey, it'd be great to have a business side of this conference. And, we were able to get 400 CEOs there with, all this content and everything else. And, I think that one of the things I learned about doing those things is just that everyone needs to trust that everyone else is doing their job. And that if you do that, then you can make it through and actually accomplish these very large, audacious things. But if you're always worrying about someone else's job and whether they're doing their job, then nothing ever happens, right? And it's been an extraordinary experience, actually, just learning to trust that everyone's actually capable of rising to the occasion.
So what would you rather do, wrangle hundreds of CEOs or run an advanced nuclear startup? Which is harder?
Oh, gosh. Look, it's probably running an advanced nuclear startup, right? It is such a steep climb.
Katherine, what's the hardest thing you've ever done?
Yeah, see, you asked me to think about this, and I was like, well, childbirth, clearly. But then I realized that, after each kid, the Men in Black, the Tommy Lee Jones with the neuralizer thing would go inside, because then I kept having them. And so maybe my fourth kid was my hardest, because then I did stop. But then I stopped back and thought, well, come on, it's got to be something professional. And it's actually not that different from what Jigar said. The hardest thing I've done professionally, because my motto is generally, how hard can it be? I can figure it out. Starting my own company was definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. And I think that's true in any sector, for sure.
All right, so you started your own company. What would it take to make you start an advanced nuclear startup?
I don't know. First of all, you got to find all the right people, right? You got to find all the people you can trust that know what they're doing. You have to find somebody who understands the cycle of development for any kind of company, and then you just got to go for it.
Well, I was recently chatting with an advanced nuclear entrepreneur who kind of backs up how difficult this really is.
I'd say we face the unexpected basically every day.
This is Caroline Cochran. She's the co-founder and chief operating officer of Oklo Power. She's probably familiar to many of the people in this room, and her experience is probably quite familiar as well.
I do think I'm a glutton for doing hard things, and there's something about being a part of making something happen that hasn't happened before that keeps me coming back and excited about the space even after, basically 10 years since we started the company.
So Oklo is developing a fast microreactor with a range of 1.5 megawatts to 50 megawatts of capacity. It uses recycled low-enriched uranium as fuel, and it could be used for microgrids, industrial sites, or other remote applications. Oklo's design is based on a technology proven decades ago, but commercializing it in a new form is anything but proven.
It feels like nearly everything we do has never been done before, from mundane business aspects like insurance to more complex things like working out fuel contracts with DOE that have never been done before. So it's challenging, but it is fun. There's a satisfaction to that.
But not every challenge has a satisfying outcome, of course. And that brings us to January 6th. No, not the January 6th you're probably thinking of. This surprise came out of Washington, D.C. a year after that.
A plan to build a new compact fast reactor at the Idaho National Laboratory is cooling off for now. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission turned down Oklo Power LLC's 2020 application.
Yeah, our reaction was complete shock because the last conversation I had with them was that they'd received what they needed and they were looking at it and they'd let us know.
The NRC did not find any safety issues regarding the design, only that the information gap could affect further review.
And then, January 6th, different January 6th situation, but we woke up to this phone call. So it was very shocking. It was very surprising. I thought commercialization would happen faster.
After nearly a decade of operation and a painstaking multi-year application process, federal nuclear regulators told Oklo to try again. So like any startup, you either bounce back or you fold. And the Oklo team bounced back, focusing on breaking the application process up, building new recycled fuel contracts with DOE, deepening testing relationships with government labs, and continuing to talk with customers.
So it's not all depressing. We haven't built things that I expected to have built by now, but at the same time, we are now laying the groundwork for the mass deployment of these things in a way I couldn't have envisioned, and it is really exciting.
So Oklo's story tells us a lot about the daunting road ahead for nuclear startups. The venture funding rounds, the lab-scale tech breakthroughs, the beautiful artistic renderings of power plants are just the start of a very long and expensive road to commercialization. In the US, the Department of Energy estimates we may need to triple nuclear capacity by mid-century from 100 gigawatts to 300 gigawatts to hit net zero emissions in the electricity sector. And McKinsey estimates we need 400 to 800 gigawatts of new nuclear globally by 2050.
And that is a staggering number. Right now, we have almost 400 gigawatts of nuclear power globally. So we're talking about, at a minimum, doubling our nuclear power capacity. That's a pretty strong modeling organization with a pretty huge number.
Dr. Laura Pierpoint is someone who might be familiar to people in this room as well. She's the CEO of Actuate Climate, where she works to speed up commercialization of deep decarbonization tech, and she's the former director of technology strategy at Exelon.
I have two minds about everything, but I will say this. I'm more excited about the nuclear industry and what's going on in the nuclear world, and particularly in the advanced nuclear sector, than I have ever been.
And interestingly, she's excited because of legacy challenges. Enthusiasm for new reactors have been tempered by economics and the reality of the regulatory process, but many startups, like Oklo, are pushing through in spite of those difficulties.
And I think we've come to an interesting sort of, waypoint through all of that, where I think the current crop of folks who are developing advanced nuclear reactor designs, the folks who are financing those designs and those companies, I think all have a healthy dose of realism about how long this is going to take and how hard it is, and are doing it anyway, which is a really great place to be.
So with that double dose of realism and optimism in mind, let me introduce the show. This is The Carbon Copy. I'm Stephen Lacey. In this week, we're coming to you live from the Nuclear Energy Assembly in Washington, D.C. I am with my longtime creative partners and guest podcast co-hosts and well-known experts, Jigar Shah and Katherine Hamilton. Katherine is the chair of 38 North, How are you, Katherine?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
And Jigar is the director of the DOE's Loan Programs Office. Hello, Jigar.
Hello. Welcome back to DC.
It's good to be here. I always get a warm, fuzzy feeling when I'm here, particularly when I come on stage. So this show comes in 3 parts today. First, we're asking how do we prepare the U.S. nuclear industry for liftoff? Then we'll dig into a new government strategy to bridge the gap to commercialization in nuclear and a range of other deep decarbonization technologies. Then what does a grid saturated with renewables, storage, and nuclear look like? And what are the ways these technologies can work together? And finally, we'll look at some investment trends across clean energy, where the capital's flowing, where it's not flowing, and does ESG backlash even matter? So you guys ready?
No.
Okay. So with demands on the grid expected to surge thanks to economy-wide electrification, we need to deploy as much low-carbon capacity as possible, right? Renewables, batteries, demand response, they're all leading the charge, but the DOE estimates we need to see maybe 550 to 770 gigawatts of clean firm capacity by 2050. That's advanced long-duration storage, geothermal, hydro, hydrogen, advanced nuclear. And if advanced nukes are going to rise to the challenge, we need clear, deliberate collaboration between the government and private developers. And DOE is doing just that with its new liftoff strategy. So we talked about that in a previous episode, and we're going to dig in to how it's going to work for nuclear. So just some initial reactions first to the opening story there. Jigar, how much of that experience is reflected in your conversations with the nuclear industry at DOE?
Yeah, it's one of those things where for a long time, government has been sort of on the sidelines, right? That it provides this extraordinary amount of funding for new designs, R&D, these other pieces. But, they were, as recently as the Obama administration, explicitly not allowed to work on commercialization, right? That there was this mandate in their funding that said anything that was beyond technology readiness level 7 was not allowed to be worked on, right? So only sectors that could commercialize with venture capital, private equity, et cetera, could be successful. And nuclear is not one of those sectors, right? Nuclear requires a deep partnership with government. Without a deep partnership with government, there's actually no way to have a thriving nuclear industry, whether it's on the fuel side or the supply chain side or just the safety part of the designs and all those things. And you see that with the Advanced Reactor Deployment Program. You see that with some of the other programs we have today. But I do think that DOE and the government was 10 years late to the game, right? These are things that they could have been doing in 2012, but I think is now happening in 2022.
All right, so we'll talk about what is happening. Katherine, let's talk about what you're seeing out there. Like, the particulars of this story are not unique to nuclear. You're working with lots of companies in long-duration storage that are working on difficult business models, pre-commercial technologies. What are the sticking points right now for the new crop of entrepreneurs working on deep decarbonization?
Yeah, and I think of transmission too, because you talk about a long time horizon. That is just a killer for folks who are trying to do new transmission technologies and building transmission. So yeah, part of it is market uncertainty. Knowing that the market's going to be there when you're ready for it is crucial. The time to market is also really important. You have to have a lot of patience, patient investment, but also just patience in the way you're doing it. And I think of, I work on public policy, but I just think of public policy as one tool. So you think of, someone has this great invention, and there are lots of really cool, interesting things happening in this industry. And you're seeing a lot of deals right now, like up 400%, the number of deals that are being cut in for nuclear technologies. But then you don't just have the technology. You have to then have, how are you going to build your business model? Who is going to pay for this? How are you going to bring both public funding and private funding together to make it happen? And then what are all those policies that are either going to help you? And so let's say a tax credit would be helpful, and think of the ones that are going to be barriers. And that would include all of these permitting regulations that are out there that the nuclear industry has to go through that are really unique to that industry. And I would say on a much smaller scale, there are other technologies that do that too. But you don't have time today to go through all of the different levels of being able to go from point A to point Z. And the good news is there are a lot of tools out there now that are allowing us to leapfrog a bit. And that's what we're hoping for in this industry too, I'm sure.
And you can see how you could potentially leapfrog in, say, long duration storage, but like it's hard to leapfrog in nuclear when you have this extensive regulatory process and you're going through a process that a lot of these other companies don't have to go through.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But in your interview, you also, the woman that you interviewed said, well, we figured out how could we shorten the cycle or at least work on other cycles at the same time.
Yep.
And I think you just have to get creative about having to do that because hard tech is exactly that. It's really hard.
Yeah, so when we say clean firm capacity, what does that entail? Like Jigar, give us an assessment of like all the different technologies we're talking about when we categorize that.
Well, I mean, I think when you define the characteristics of clean firm, I think what we're talking about is when a polar vortex occurs, when you have a heat wave, when you have some of these other unexpected events, like we want to make sure that we have reliable power to help people navigate those events, right? Navigate the cold, the heat, et cetera, right? And so when you think about clean firm technologies, almost anything can be clean firm, right? So obviously you have nuclear and geothermal and hydro and technologies like that, but it could also be variable renewable energy paired with long duration energy storage, right? Or it could be natural gas power plants paired with carbon sequestration and storage, or other types of technologies there. I think what happens though is when you start to think about it this way, and you saw that in the Lazard levelized cost of energy analysis, which just came out, where for the first time they talked about what does it cost to firm all these technologies. Almost everything came in above $100 a megawatt hour, right? I mean, everything from renewable energy that was cheap, let's call it $30 a megawatt hour, adding 20, 30 hours of battery storage, to natural gas plus carbon sequestration and storage to nuclear. And so part of, I think, our challenge is that as we think about adding load around this whole electrify everything effort, right? I mean, we think about it in electric vehicles and heat pumps, but it's also the industrial processes that can be electrified, or hell, it could be Bitcoin and AI, right? I mean, if ChatGPT takes off, that's another 10,000 megawatts of data centers required, right? And so where does all that power come from, right? And I think when you think about where we are on the practical limitations of the grid, you can clearly run the existing grid with business as usual growth with a bunch of technologies that have 90% capacity utilization, and then battery storage at the end nodes, right? So that you're using up all that power. Or you can put in a bunch of technologies at 25% to 40% capacity utilization, but then you have to 3x the grid, right? And then you got to get that done, right? And so there are all of these ways of getting there, and then along the way, you end up having all these really practical issues around 85,000 power plant workers that are going to be laid off with shutting down coal plants and natural gas plants at their end of life. Most of those communities receive 25% of their property tax income from those power plants, and so that's a huge hole in their budget that deserves a just transition, right? And so when you start to think about all the different things like clean firm on the engineering side, but then the reality of how people are affected on the other side, nuclear becomes part of the solution to that problem.
Katherine, how do you categorize the technologies and applications?
Yeah, so I think my categories, some of the technologies are exactly the same as what Jigar has said, but I also think I spend a lot of time on the demand side thinking about how do we actually harness what you would normally consider load and have that become more of a resource. Because what you're looking for in addition to reliability is resilience. If you fail fast, you got to come back fast. And I think what that means is we have to be much better system thinkers. We have to be much better at being able to connect the dots on what's happening on the customer side to what's happening on what would be traditionally the supply side, and realize that nuclear power is a really key component of that, and also that it has more than just being able to provide clean, firm power. It actually also needs to be seen and operated as flexible generation. And I think flexibility is going to be the key in the future. No matter how much clean firm we need, something can always take a plant down. But if you know you have the flexibility built in and that you have the system designed as a system of systems, then you're going to be in much better shape. And nuclear has a huge role to play in that.
Yeah, that feeds well into the grid management discussion we're going to have in a few minutes. Let's dig deeper into the liftoff report. So Jigar, you open up the report. You're very blunt. Your team is very blunt. It says advanced nuclear is at a commercial stalemate. Probably not a surprise for many of the people here. How would you describe that stalemate?
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you think about a nuclear power plant, it particularly when you look at Vogtle, where we've invested billions of dollars out of the Loan Programs Office into a loan there. These are custom-made components, right? I mean, almost everything in there. These valves are, larger than a human being, right, in terms of how large they are, right? And what happened was ultimately, when you think about Southern Nuclear, there's lots of lessons learned, and we can go through them. But ultimately, even if it came in on time and on budget, for an electric utility company to take on a $16 billion liability, right, to build that up is a lot for them to handle, right? Most utility companies just have a really hard time grappling with that much risk and their public service commissions, et cetera, right? So you end up in a situation where that format, even if it, from an engineering standpoint, is the lowest possible cost of power, was very difficult from a risk management standpoint, right? And so you now have seen the embracing of a small modular nuclear reactor, right? Where each 300 megawatt reactor might be $2 billion, where a lot of folks can handle that. And if you build 4 of them, you get to $8 billion. And when you look at Vogtle Unit 3 and Unit 4 has come in 30% cheaper than Unit 3. So no matter what Unit 1 comes in at, even if it's at $12,000, $15,000 a kilowatt, you can take those learnings and really reduce the cost of Unit 2, 3, and 4 on the same site, right? So now you've got a risk profile that I think people might be able to get their arms around, and you see that Ontario Power Group has actually made the first new reactor order in a long time here in North America, and then TVA is looking to follow their lead. But even then, you need 20 orders, right? Like, how do you build a supply chain? If you're a forge company, how do you build a forge, right? How do you like scale up the supply chain of wire harnesses and all of the component parts that are required for one deployment, right? It's just, that's the commercial stalemate, right? Is that for a lot of the electric utility companies, they're saying, we want to see OPG be fully successful at deploying a reactor, bringing it in basically on time and on budget, maybe a 50% cost of run for the first unit, before we're comfortable going to our Public Service Commission with an order for our reactor, right? And that then prevents OPG from succeeding, because then it's hard for them to get the supply chain built up for their reactor, right? And so figuring out how we all send signals to each other in an incremental way, that if this happens, then we're going to come in and we'll be, order number 14 or 15 or 18 or whatever it is critical, because without that order book, you just don't have a commercial industry to invest into, right? And so then you end up with an inability to take off for the first facility.
So Katherine, you've worked closely with DOE over the course of your career. You worked at NREL at one point earlier in your career. You're familiar with how the government thinks about commercialization. Like, what are the tried and true strategies that influence the liftoff plan? And like, what feels new, like a meet the moment kind of thing?
Yeah, so you have to get in the Wayback Machine with me to go back to when I was at NREL. And I feel like that was the day when DOE was tackling one valley of death. So you would develop the technology, and I worked a lot on cellulosic biofuels. I worked a little bit on geothermal too, and these are really difficult, just as nuclear is, to get off the ground. These are big, capital-intensive processes. And we would give money to build a pilot plant, and and then just say, all right, you got your pilot, let's go. And there was not a recognition that actually there are many more valleys of death. You kind of have to follow along and go to the next one and let the government come in then. I mean, this is, as you said, an iterative process, right? So there are lots of different valleys of death. And I think that's what this liftoff report shows, is that there are different places where we have to engage. And also, we have to have the private sector with us all along. You can't just have them come in someplace down the road. They have to be part of the entire journey from the very beginning to when you're really to scale. And I think the liftoff reports do a really good job of shining a light on that, on the fact that we need to have the government engage all the way. And you look at what the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program is doing, and everything is 50-50 cost shared. And that is how it should be, right? You need the private sector to get skin in the game so that they will have a reason to stay with you throughout.
So Jigar, I don't mean to minimize the work, but I've seen a lot of reports in my day, a lot of big, well-written reports that have gathered a lot of dust on the shelves. Like what, if you're going to create a steady state of deployment for nuclear after 2040, as this report identifies, how do you sort of create the programs, make them leap off the page, and what do you need to do between now and 2030 to develop that build-out, and create that steady state industry as you've identified? Because if we delay by even 5 years, that has huge ramifications.
Yeah, so the liftoff reports, and as you know, there was the nuclear report, but then we also had carbon management, hydrogen, and then long duration energy storage, and we have our next set of reports that we're writing now for liftoff in August or September. And I think that the goal of the liftoff reports is not to reflect DOE strategy or policy, but instead to reflect what we're hearing the private sector is saying that they're going to do and what that interaction looks like, right? So when you read the liftoff report, there's a couple of big themes in there. One is that that Vogel had a lot of lessons learned, right? And you saw that GE Hitachi decided that they were going to spend $400 million up front with TVA, OPG, and Synthos to be able to avoid starting construction with a 20% complete design, right? And that's a big deal. And we saw GE Hitachi read the liftoff report as part of writing it, and doing exactly what they said the lessons learned were, right? The other piece of it, though, is that it describes very clearly where the electric utilities are. So there are 4 major suggestions that they make there. One of which is this risk-sharing model, right? So they were saying that that in order for us to come in, we're happy to pay the $2 billion for the plant, and then we're happy to eat the next $1 billion if there's a cost overrun. But then we need DOE to come in and share the next cost overrun above that 50-50, right? So that we then can feel like there's a greater amount of trust building with the public service commissions that we're having to get through, right? That was the private sector putting something on the table. Now, I have no idea whether Congress is going to give me the money to do that, but it reflects the best thinking that the private sector has today around how to get over their own fears of putting in a reactor order, right? And so this report is not something that DOE has to implement. This is a report that reflects what the private sector has to implement. And then DOE can say, okay, if they do their part, how do we realign our programs and our capital that we've been given by Congress to meet them where they want us to meet them, right? And so the beauty of this report compared to other reports is that it's not up to DOE to implement this. It's up to the private sector to implement this, because this is a reflection of what they told us they needed. Right? Well, great. Now that you've told us what you needed, I hope you're implementing the stuff that you told us you needed, and then we'll watch carefully. And and the other thing I'd say is that it's entirely possible that 20 important voices didn't bother to tell us what they needed, and for the next version of this liftoff report, they will, and it'll reflect more of their unvarnished opinions around what they think that they're prepared to do, and what they think DOE needs to do to get them to do their part, right? And that's a messy conversation, but I do think that it is an important one, because if we're going to be private sector led and government enabled, the private sector has to learn how to tell us what to do.
So Katherine, as you read through this report, like what, if you look at long duration storage versus carbon capture versus advanced nuclear, like are there a lot of similarities across the approaches?
Well, they approached it with the same intent, which is to hear from stakeholders and to kind of take them through a similar process, but the answers are really different, right?
Yeah.
There's really different amounts of investment that's needed in different places in all of these technologies. So the reports, while they present as quite similar and they are asking similar questions of stakeholders and the private sector, the results are very different and the needs are very different. So that is also the beauty of it. The other beauty of it is that they are considered evergreen. So they're living documents. So as we progress, you can continue to provide more input. You may even get additional feedback from the private sector that will then help you adjust or pivot what the government is doing.
If I can just add something right there, Katherine, like it is very clear from the reports that hydrogen and carbon management have already seen liftoff, right? There's $40+ billion worth of announcements on real projects, and we outline that in the report of the 17 different, sort of use cases that people promulgating on hydrogen. 3 of them have most of the money. And carbon management, we do the same thing. And it's also very clear that you don't have liftoff in nuclear or long duration energy storage, right? That here are the challenges that we see now. And so, we're trying to be as honest as the private sector was with us. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
So to wrap up this segment, I want to talk about Plant Vogtle for one moment. And I did talk to Laura Pearpoint about her experience in actually visiting the site.
So one thing to know about me is I'm a huge fan of so-called industrial tourism. I love learning by seeing real things in action. And the most fascinating trip I have ever taken was to see the second Plant Vogtle as it was being finished in Georgia just this past January.
And she came away from that visit feeling conflicted, like inspired by this enormous feat of engineering, but with the extreme cost overruns, years-long delays, she also felt that difficulty of scale.
They had to do a pretty big excavation for the 2 reactors that they built there in order to, put the concrete pads in and everything else. And so there is now a gigantic dirt pile next to where they've built these 2 reactors. And the top of that pile currently represents the highest point in Burke County. So literally just digging the hole for these nuclear reactors has changed the topology statistics of the local county. I'm looking at all of this and thinking about how unbelievably daunting it is. But at the same time, one of the really interesting things is they went much faster and were able to be far cheaper with the second plant than the first plant, especially given that a lot of the workers knew what they were doing the second time and were able to port right over. So that's really exciting. And then when you think about the amount of electricity that these reactors are going to produce, it's just enormous. And at the end of the day, you're standing on this one site and it's going to provide electricity to an entire region. And that's a really incredible and, no pun intended, a really powerful thing. So it was really, really interesting to see what our future could look like if we're able to start doing this on a more regular basis, particularly globally.
So you're sitting down with your family or your partner planning a vacation, and one person says, let's go to the Azores, and another says, let's go to Thailand. And you're like, no, let's go to Waynesboro, Georgia, and go check out those dirt piles and concrete pads.
Absolutely. You have to. It's so much fun.
So Jigar, to wrap this up, what do you take from that learning experience at Plant Vogtle? Are we on a path to continued learning in this industry, or is it a one-off thing?
I'm inspired, right? I was the guy who built the largest solar project in the United States in 2007, which was, 8 megawatts in Alamosa, Colorado. And it was a feat to behold then. And it was a lot of work. It was really hard work. And, when you think about, the PPA we signed back then, which was at 19 cents a kilowatt hour, and where solar has gotten to today, I just think when you think about the sheer amount of persistence that it took to build Vogtle, right? 13,000 workers, IBW workers, were trained there, right? Many of them, started at 17 years old when they, came in as apprentices, and they've now paid off all the debts for their entire family, right? Through the living wage that they received. And, they're now journeymen, that are there, and they're now going to build the next set of nuclear plants, right? I just think that doing the first thing, doing that first project is always extraordinarily hard, and I'm inspired by the fact that we really had the grit to see it through.
So let's shift now to how the grid is going to work. And we touched on this a little bit at the start, but a DOE analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act finds that under a best case scenario, it could cut emissions 50% in the power sector. So an evaluation of like a half a dozen major power sector analyses from NREL to Princeton to Breakthrough Institute shows that we need around 200 gigawatts of nuclear to decarbonize the power system alongside renewables and batteries. So how are all these technologies going to play together on the grid? I want to talk about some hybrid systems, about how they'll function together. Katherine, first, let's just dig deeper into the role of clean firm capacity on a grid that is increasingly distributed, renewable, and digital. Like, what does the modeling tell us the grid's going to look like in a decade and beyond, thanks to the IRA?
Yeah, all the modeling does show exactly the results that you're talking about. So clean electricity, which is now about 40%, and I would say that is, in a very broad sense, that's renewables, nuclear, fossil with CCS, all of those technologies that are either low or zero emission. So we're at about 40% today, and by 2030, between 70 and 90%. And it's also about 70 to 90% of carbon reduction. And this is as a result of the combination of two things. It's not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's also the infrastructure bill. So the infrastructure bill is crucial because it really provides some of the foundation from which we can launch the Inflation Reduction Act. And we will find, $800 billion in addition in avoided climate damage. So money that we would have to pay as the climate crisis wreaks havoc everywhere. And so these two bills are crucial to getting everything deployed. And I would say a lot of the modeling doesn't deal with the distribution side of the grid. Most of it does deal with the supply side of the grid. So I think if you actually combined everything, you're going to get a lot more done than even these models are showing. However, you also are dependent upon a lot of things. Like, you need to make sure that the technology costs and performances are there, that you are able to deploy renewable energy at a reasonable cost, that you're able to build transmission where you need it, that the natural gas prices don't go crazy, and that the CO2 pipeline is, that's also going to be crucial if you think about a hydrogen economy. So there are a lot of things that have to fall into place. But right now, the market signals are there, and also the co-investment from the government signals are there.
Jigar, I want to hear your thoughts on specific applications. NREL has explored this question extensively with a focus on like hybrid renewable systems that could provide both electricity and industrial heat. I talked to Laura Pierpoint about this important function.
Particularly for advanced nuclear, there are certain designs that have really high heat levels. So they heat steam upwards of 900 degrees Celsius. And so there's some really interesting things you can do with industrial off-takers to provide really high heat and decarbonize what would otherwise be really tricky to decarbonize processes if they require heat at that temperature.
And there's definitely a possibility for nuclear plants to toggle between those services depending on the needs of the grid or the industrial off-taker.
So I think between that and storage and renewables, you could really have a pretty solid way of powering a city and of powering some additional industrial stuff near that city.
And then Caroline Cochran of Oklo thinks that new reactor designs, like the one that Oklo's building, can help with more sophisticated load following.
Light water plants or water-cooled plants, by the nature of their physics, literally have a limit to how fast they can scale up and down. There's a potential for advanced nuclear to play exceptionally well. And I say advanced because many of the technologies, some number of technologies, ours in particular, are able to load follow much more rapidly than historical nuclear.
And the trend towards smaller plants could open up new applications. Like Oklo's working on a 15 megawatt reactor, talking to customers about applications upwards of 50 megawatts, and they could help offset the tens of thousands of backup diesel generators in California that are there, hidden in the background for reliability reasons.
That's actually a strong suit for what we're working on in advanced nuclear. Our company in particular is working on, starting very small, but also scaling up from there for different market needs. So I think this small scale use of power generation as needed in different areas, and hopefully the development of a smart grid will further enable these kinds of technologies to really work well together. So I'm excited about that size range for sure.
So what do you think, Jigar? What is compelling to you about different applications of nuclear?
Well, I think that we have to actually solve for the bulk that we need in the grid, right? Not just the, fancy, interesting sort of like, assemblies that we put together. Like, I'll give you an example. We're dealing with, the 45V credit for hydrogen right now, right? Right now, given interconnection queue challenges, the most amount of renewables that you can add to the grid right now is about 50 gigawatts a year. Right? Now, maybe we'll get that solved next week. Maybe it'll take a month. We'll see. But it's 50 gigawatts a year. In order to build 10 million tons of hydrogen, you're talking about 200 gigawatts of renewables that have to then be built and then converted into hydrogen, right? So, if you're only doing 50 gigawatts a year and 200 of it goes into clean hydrogen, well, then not that much of it is actually going to shut down natural gas plants or coal plants, right? And so part of the challenge I see with all this is bulk. Like, you need a huge amount of electricity, just in a gigantic amount of electricity. I just think that, we think about this from a U.S. point of view, right? Which is great. Like, and I was at the National Hydro Association conference last week, is Water Week, I think is what it was called. And, they're also sort of like in this commercial stalemate. It's like, well, these turbines are modern engineering. We love these turbines. They've been around since 1930s and they continue to work. I was like, yeah, but don't modern turbines produce 15% more power and then they're more capable of, bringing in weather data and then operating more efficiently? Oh yeah, and they're more fish safe and all that stuff, but these turbines are fantastic. I was like, I get it, but we need to upgrade all these turbines and produce 15% more power. That's a lot of bulk, right? And most of the grid right now is balanced with hydro, right? Like, hydro is one of our largest balancing resources. So I just think that one of the challenges I see from a top-down perspective is just thinking about bulk. Everyone is thinking about like, well, but we could do either solar or hydro or wind or whatever. We need to do all of it, and we're probably still unlikely to actually reach the total amount of like kilowatt hours we need. So I think that's point number one. The second piece then is industrial, right? So when I was at CERAWeek, I talked to like ExxonMobil, I talked to Dow. You saw the announcement maybe from X Energy and Dow where they're gonna like create a clean plastics plant. And the goal of that plant in Texas is to then ship that clean plastic to EV manufacturers who then can, reduce the carbon footprint of their EVs, right? So I think when you think about like that use case, like their excitement is really around this technology providing the use case. We can sort of say, but here are 6 other ones. But if you're customer driven, right, that's what the customer wants to buy, right? So I think that's the next point I make. The last point I'd make is that you've got 3 big sections of nuclear, right? So you've got the AP1000, which if you talk to engineers, are going to say, by definition, the best ever, safe, will generate the lowest cost of power. Fine. I don't think any EPC contractor wants to wrap that thing and provide you a guarantee price, but whatever, practicality be damned. And then you've got small modular reactors, which are not so modular, but they're small. And they're basically capable of, getting an EPC wrap. That's a $2 billion thing. And then you've got these microreactors. I think they mostly call themselves nuclear batteries because you're unlikely to be able to refuel them, right? So they sort of come with their standard fuel. And in that case, they're more expensive, but they're truly a manufactured product. You will have a factory, just like an offshore wind factory that makes these 13 to 15 megawatt offshore wind nacelles, make microreactors that are, that are coming off the factory floor, 100 of them a year, right, out of the factory. And that's pretty awesome too. And we'll see which succeeds, but you could imagine that it's not cost per kilowatt hour that wins, per se, as opposed to the American approach to the private sector and government support will likely make us more successful at a certain set of reactor designs over another set of reactor designs. And I think that's something that's totally plausible.
So, Katherine, there's been this like long-running war between hardcore renewables advocates and hardcore nuclear advocates who are like constantly pointing out the flaws of each technology. And as we all know, energy is all about trade-offs. And it's about managing those and engineering around those trade-offs. How do you think about that framing? I mean, it seems to be disappearing a bit. It's a really tired debate, and it's going away. But I think people are still in their camps, and to some degree. Like, how do you think about that framing, and like, how does it fit into actually how we manage the grid coming up?
Yeah, so I think that's a good way to put the question, because it is a framing issue. So, when renewables were first starting out, the nuclear industry was the incumbent. I worked for a utility for 10 years, and that was how we got most of our power, was through nuclear energy, and it was stable and it was there, and renewables were kind of this other little thing. And they were also very much pushed by the environmental community. And the environmental community was very opposed to nuclear because of the fuel issue. And so that was, I think, the first big driver, was the environmental community wanting to make sure that renewables came in and took more of the share of generation. Now, they call it big wind. I mean, wind and solar are requiring an enormous footprint. There is pushback. Those industries are grown up, and they're realizing there are a lot more people who are going to push back on us, because now we're being seen as the incumbent that just wants to grow. And I think that the reality is, when you talk to a developer, wind or solar developer, they're always thinking about how are we going to be able to maximize what we're doing, how are we going to be able to make sure that we don't have to curtail, that we generate good revenue, and they have to find partners to do that. Now, some of those partners are going to be in storage, but some of them are going to be in nuclear too. And as Jigar says, it's not a monolithic industry. You might have different technologies that are going to pair with different renewables. And people have been thinking about this for a while. I know NREL has done papers, a decade ago, 5 years ago, about how you would pair this. But I think the reality is going to be, going forward, because of issues with land and availability, also with interconnection, that it's going to become more of the conversation is how do we pair these technologies to really get what we want, to drive up profits for developers, to make sure that we lower curtailment, and that we really keep more things operating for everybody's benefit.
Jigar, have we evolved beyond the sort of last decades of Twitter spats and how we frame this?
I don't know, right? Twitter is Twitter. I think they feature spats. But, I think we are, after the Ukraine crisis, I do think that energy abundance has taken on a realism that I think a lot of people just didn't fathom before that, right? I think there was a feeling that, we sort of had plenty of energy around, and that we could sort of just make trade-offs and choices. And I think after the Ukraine crisis, you needed LNG, you needed, to deploy heat pumps at scale, you needed to think about virtual power plants, you needed to think about all of these sort of solutions to try to get back to energy abundance, right? And I think energy abundance is what's on the minds of most folks, including the folks who are, increasing the amount of coal that they're using today.
All right, we've got 10 minutes left, so let's go to our third topic and just touch on investment trends, so capital flows, constraints, investor attitudes. For a macro view of how investor sentiment is shaping up, I reached out to Reverend Kirsten Snow Spalding, who's the vice president of the Ceres Investor Network. Do you prefer Kirsten or Reverend Snow Spalding?
Kirsten.
How often are these themes coming into your Sunday sermons?
They do come into my Sunday sermons. I do this work because it's important to financial markets, but I also do this work because it is necessary for everything that we care about.
So the world hit a very important milestone in 2022. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, over $1 trillion was invested in clean energy that year. Electric vehicles, storage, renewables saw the biggest jumps in investment. Nuclear investment was flat. Meanwhile, large banks and institutional investors are still putting trillions of dollars into fossil fuels, even as they tout their net zero plans. So how do we read that figure?
I think, the numbers that BNEF have produced are really important. The answer is not enough. But what I see is a gradual shift.
So when we're saying not enough, what do you mean by that? How would you characterize not enough?
Well, I think it varies from investor to investor. So we have some really focused asset managers who specialize in clean energy infrastructure, who are really thinking about the alternative technologies. Some are working in early stage, some are working with very developed technologies and scaling them. So those specialists, I think, are really leading the way. But for the biggest multi-asset class managers and owners, there's got to be a real shift as we decarbonize the existing portfolios. And if they're largely in the passive asset class, we're just not seeing the opportunities there.
So we have this stark contrast. Investors are increasingly looking to stop investing directly in funding fossil fuels. But the world's largest asset managers with passive portfolios, which includes bonds and equities, are heavily exposed to fossil fuels still. So what are the forces driving and delaying the surge of money into clean energy? And how do we maintain not just $1 trillion of investment every single year, but trillions annually by the end of the decade? So Jigar, in 2013, you wrote this book called Creating Climate Wealth. It outlined the strong economic case for a rapid energy transition. Do the investment figures we're seeing right now line up with what you expected to see by this point?
Yeah, I think they're obviously short of where we need to be. And I think part of that is, as we talked about before, we lost a decade, right? The Loan Programs Office was dormant for a decade, but also the world was talking about how the technologies that we had available to deploy were not worth deploying, and that we needed to double down on innovation instead of deployment. I think we now know that that was just an enormous mistake, and that we lost 10 years, right? And it's not just in nuclear. We lost 10 years in hydro. We lost 10 years in geothermal. We lost 10 years in lots of sectors, long duration energy storage. A lot of these technologies were worth deploying then. And I think when you look at which technologies are making up the $1 trillion today, it's the ones that people couldn't keep down, right? It's the one that, because people were saying bad things about solar and wind and electric vehicles 10 years ago, right? But Elon Musk couldn't be stopped. The rest of us in the solar industry couldn't be stopped. The wind guys couldn't be stopped. The lithium-ion battery guys couldn't be stopped. And so they kept going. And magically, as if Wright's Law wasn't invented in 1939, they actually, figured out a way to get their costs down, right? And that's why they're scaling now to $1 trillion. And these other sectors all have the ability to scale to $1 trillion too. Nuclear, geothermal, hydro, carbon management, hydrogen, all of these sectors, had we started 10 years ago, would be at the same place. But we didn't. It is what it is. So now we got to start next week, right? And we got to figure out how to get those technologies across the bridge to bankability. And then once they get to that point, then all of those big asset managers will say, actually, this solar, wind, EV fund I have are going to add more commas and add these other technologies because there's actually enough history that we feel comfortable with the risk reward, and we'll invest in those. And it is what it is. I can't cry over spilt milk, but I can say that it's a bias that we have to move away from now. We still have to do innovation. Let's not kid ourselves. But we have a lot of technologies worth deploying, and when you think about what the UAE accomplished with Korea in the UAE recently to build their 4 reactors and others, right? You're starting to see that these technologies are worth deploying at scale.
So fun fact about Katherine, every question I have can be perfectly tailored to a certain point in her career. I got to ask about your work at NREL, you worked on the IRA, you've worked at a utility, and you also worked in private equity. So tell us, given your experience in private equity, where's the investment activity the strongest, and where is it the weakest?
Yeah, it's interesting. Based on what Jigar said, I was just going to say innovators going to innovate. Innovation didn't stop. It just, the support for it came in different places. And I work with all clean tech, climate tech companies, and they're supported by a number of different types of funds. And I would just say a lot of these are end uses, hard to decarbonize sectors, industrial processes, plastics, agriculture. We're working with a company that makes leather out of cow DNA. I don't know how they do it, but it's amazing. There are all these super interesting people out there innovating. And there are also those who are trying to improve the processes that we've had for a long time. Geothermal, some of the new geothermal technologies, some of the new fusion technologies. Hydrogen, of course, has been really hot. When I went and I called a bunch of investors and just said, hey, what are you all thinking about for nuclear? And I got a bunch of different responses. So for the VCs, they're like, you know what, there's just such a timeline to operation. There's such a risk in that and so much regulatory uncertainty. I'm not really thinking about that right now. I talked to a late venture early growth company, and again, they said the permitting timelines are really tough for nuclear. However, you look at the Microsoft announcement, that's huge. That's corporates. Corporates saying, you know what, we're gonna do this. And Microsoft invested in Helion, a fusion company, and they have a 2028 PPA. I mean, they're gonna start operating. And I think that's gonna drive us. It's the corporates as much as anybody else, because they're putting their money into having to make sure that they operate their facilities the way they wanna operate them with all of the needs that they have, whether it's AI, whether it's data management. All of these corporates are really stepping up, where I'm not seeing as much on the VC side. I mean, you'll see some you'll see some folks like Breakthrough, some early stage who have very patient capital, but I think the corporates are driving it now.
Yeah, the corporate piece is interesting too, and a company like Microsoft is also making some early stage investments in direct air capture as well, and they say, like, we're a company that understands technology risk, we're willing to make some of these bets. So on that note, on like the strategic investment side, obviously, like ultimately we need utilities to want to invest in this. So Jigar, what do you see on both of you actually, what do you see on the utility side, like in terms of the appetite? Because ultimately, like they're the ones who are gonna wanna really invest in these plants.
So we participated in the Guggenheim Nuclear Conference in 2022. At that point, every stock analyst basically said, if a utility announced a nuclear plant, we'd probably downgrade the stock, right? This last year, in 2023, we went to the same conference, and the stock analysts were like, actually, you've done a great job educating us. We understand now the way the risk-reward frameworks are working, and we're actually very bullish on Duke and Dominion and and Pacific Core and others who put nuclear into their integrated resource plans. So that's starting to send those CEOs the right signals. But they still, as you've heard me say before, I mean, utilities operate at the speed of utility jealousy, right? So there has to be another utility that goes before them, and then one of their other peers that goes before them, and then they want to be third or fourth in line, right? And so we're doing that, right? I mean, that's why OPG is going first, and really respect the fact that the Canadian government's providing the support to do that. BW RX 300, is moving that forward, and that, that company does a lot of work for the nuclear navy. And so you're starting to see folks moving forward. They're putting in their integrated resource plan. They're spending the $50 million for the early site permit. They're doing the things that they feel like they can comfortably do, but inching things forward. And the goal, I think, is by 2025, 2026, right, when OPG is in full construction, for there to be 20 orders that come in, right? And I think once that happens, then I think all the electric utilities will come very quickly, because they have a huge amount of pressure on them, frankly, from these coal communities who want to just transition.
I see the clock has hit 0 here in front of us, so I just want to round it out. I was going to ask about the kerfuffle around ESG, but it's just kind of a madhouse, so we probably don't even need to talk about all the insanity around ESG. But I guess the last question I'll ask is about sort of how we reconcile the short-term boost right now for fossil fuels with the structural headwinds for fossil fuels. Like, we're in this moment when a lot of investors have switched a short-term focus back to fossil fuels because of high prices, thanks to the supply crunch globally. And when we look at oil and gas shares against benchmark indices, they performed worse on a decade time scale. But I wonder how you reconcile sort of with the short-term activity that we've seen with the long-term structural headwinds.
I mean, I think you have to be careful about worrying about stock prices. Part of the reason why LNG is where it is today is because of its strategic nature around global energy politics. I think when you think about nuclear, the U.S. is in a much different place today in the world than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? And we clearly have the best nuclear technologies in the world. And you hear that. Eastern Europeans all want our technologies over the French or the Korean or Russian or Chinese designs, right? But they want us to build it first and then build the next one there, right? And when you think about what it means to deploy nuclear power into a country, it means an 80-year relationship with that country, right? So you can imagine whether it's the Department of Defense or the State Department or other parts of the US government, they're viewing our prowess in nuclear in the same way that they viewed, fracking and LNG. Around how this works globally. For all of these countries that are going to COP, who are saying, hey, we have all these big goals, but we're very heavily dependent on coal, they all want US technology, not just nuclear. They want US nuclear, right? And the US has to show up, right? And that means that we have to show up here first and build our first reactors here, and then they want to buy the next ones. You saw that with Poland, with the AP1000, and I think you're going to see that with a lot of these other nuclear designs that we build here first.
Katherine, how do you sort of parse the short-term supply crunch, rise in fossil fuel prices, investor sentiment shifting with these long-term structural changes in the energy sector?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jigar that is short-term. I mean, we have all the market signals in place now. The Inflation Reduction Act is not going anywhere. We need to put our mouth where the money is. We need to start building. And I think as a country, we are now going to be able to show that leadership. I mean, Canada is just putting tax credits into place faster than they possibly can think of, because they know everybody was going to go up to Ontario, and now people are thinking about maybe we should stay here instead because it's looking really good in the market. So I think long term, we've shifted and we're going to continue to go, and we just have to depend on all of the folks here and elsewhere in the world who are coming up with new technologies that are really going to get us there.
I love that phrase, put your mouth where the money is. Well, we'll certainly be using our mouths as the transition unfolds. Jigar Shah and Katherine Hamilton, and I'm Stephen Lacey. Thanks, everyone, for checking the show out.